You're listening to Leadership Powered by Common Sense with your host, Doug Thorpe. Here's Doug.
Well, hello again, everyone. I hope you're having a great day, whatever time of day it might be for you. This is Doug Thorpe, and you're listening to another episode of Leadership Powered by Common Sense. Today, I've got a gentleman who has spent much of his career in the human resources and talent management realm. He's got some great brands on his resume, and I'll let him describe that. But most importantly, he has summarized a lot of those takeaways into a book that is making, I think, some great waves, and even to the point of allowing him to exit his corporate gig and become a bit of an entrepreneur. We may talk about that conversion journey as well, but his name is Greg Morley. Greg, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Doug. It's a real pleasure to be with you, and I love the work that you do, and it's been great since I was introduced to you following your work, and look forward to our conversation today.
So let's start by touching a bit on your career journey and describe for us the arc that you were on and some of the opportunities you had along the way.
You know, I was reflecting on this recently and reflecting on what were the big pivotal moments of my career. I spent a majority of my career, as you noted, in human resources, in talent development, talent management. I was fortunate to have worked for companies like GE and Disney and Hasbro and finally LVMH. And I'm speaking with you from Paris because that's where I landed my last career gig here in Paris, working for LVMH as the head of global diversity and inclusion. And if I track back the arc, it actually does start in a very entrepreneurial way. When I was younger and with my friends, we used to park cars at the parties in the neighborhood. And one of the things that I learned in that journey of starting at car parking and ending up in a luxury wines and spirits company was the value of the work that's done by the people in the organization. And I've always tried to understand that and focus on it for as long as I was in human resources and maybe as senior as I became, to really understand the motivations of people in the organization, what they're trying to get out of their jobs and their careers, and frankly, how the organization can get the best out of people, creating environments where people can, as the book is titled, bloom where they're planted, and really try to nurture people in the roles that they take on.
You know, so many things come out of that. You know, as most of my listeners know, I share a bit of time in the Fortune 500 realm, and certainly do some coaching in that universe now. But I also split time in the totally entrepreneurial, the small and mid-sized business sphere. When I think about the corporate setting, as you say, you know, bloom where they're planted. From a leadership standpoint, too often. And I don't have a hard statistic to cite, but I just know it both personally and from anecdotal experience. Leaders inherit teams, so they don't really get the privilege of a white paper or a white slate to just build a team. Sometimes you do, and occasionally that happens with a reorg or a merger or something like that. But generally, leaders in those bigger companies get moved around, and they are moved into a seat that already has a pre-existing structure to it, and you inherit this team of others, whether it's frontline contributors or levels of management beneath you. Let's start, if you will, by talking about that sort of inherited mode and from your experience, what should a leader do when they're making that initial transition with a pre-existing team? Because, you know, there's so many dynamics to that. There's a pre-existing culture. There's some already rules of engagement that are in play, and the leader becomes the outsider moving in.
Absolutely. And I would say, even in my experience when building teams from scratch, I did that in Hong Kong, I did that in Shanghai. Not only, you know, you inherit teams sometimes that are pre-built, but even when you hire a team from scratch, you inherit other people's experiences. So even team members can come, like a new leader can come, with their own predetermined or pre-wired ways of working, expectations, and that kind of thing. One of the things that I think is absolutely critical in a new leader coming into a role is to spend more time in the beginning listening than speaking. So if someone hires me to do a job, they'd say, okay, we need you to go be the head of HR for this division. They've clearly seen that I have done something in the past that can have a positive impact on that new job, that new place. And in my experience, a lot of the times I moved jobs, they were for teams that were in crisis or teams that were being rebuilt or teams that were being rescoped. So there was normally something quite messy. And usually there's an expectation in that kind of situation that the leader just gets in there and makes change happen quickly. The most important thing in those situations is with any new leadership job is to really take time and listen and not do it as well, I listened and then I checked off the box, but to really get to know the people, get to know the colleagues that have a relation to that team, spend time with, if it's a commercial role, spend time with customers and clients and really try to understand what's going on so that yes, inherently you're going to have some fallbacks that you've always used in your leadership journey that are successful, but it will allow you to contextualize what you do. It's very, very easy, I think, when you're new in a job to make a quick judgment. And that's a human behavior. The discipline of leadership is to put the judgment to the side as a note, continue your learning and curiosity. And this doesn't have to go on forever. This is just a matter of probably weeks. But so that when you get to the point of starting to make some substantial decisions, whether that's about the strategy that you're going to implement, whether that's about the team members that you have that you may want to keep, promote, move on, reallocate, that you really do that with the full context of what's happening, rather than what happens oftentimes is we can get caught up in the loudest voices, and then we react to the loudest voices, react to the most urgent situations. They may not be representative of what's actually happening in your new team.
Yeah, that's totally very important, and I have often advised people making transitions like that to do that listening more than speaking and really allow the intake of people's abilities and attitudes and mindsets and certainly not go in just and throw as we used to say in the Army, throw a grenade in the bunker and hope for the best. It's like, no, you can't do that.
And there's a trap, I think, for new leaders sometimes. When I was saying about leaders are selected because of what they've done in the past, and I've seen many times where a leader will come in and because of what made them successful in the past, they bring that over, they try to apply it in a new job. And oftentimes it fails because that's not the same context. You see it very often when people are moving in different locations. So oftentimes in one big company, they move from, say, like in my journey in Disney, I moved from Orlando to California. Now, it was one theme park to another theme park, and you would say, well, it was the same Disney, right? But it wasn't. Because in Orlando, there was a very different culture, a different operating culture than when you stepped foot in Disneyland, which had this, back to Walt Disney culture. Everybody knew which park bench he had sat on, and it was a much more conservative organization. And so you really had to understand, okay, I know a lot about the company. I don't know how this one works. So don't be fooled by what seemingly similarities exist as you're trying to understand how you make impact.
I don't want to get too far off track of what I'd like us to talk about, but you said something I want to spend a minute talking about. You talked about the leader who is recognized for a past performance, gets identified to move into a new role for something. And typically with a lot of my executive leaders that I coach, we talk about the notion of building a personal brand so that you do, in fact, get noted and recognized for something that you intend to be noted for. You don't want that to be accidental. You want to have some intentionality about it from a personal level. So talk to us a little bit about maybe ways that you've seen people do that well so that, without being egotistical or brash or narcissistic, just being proactive, and I go back to the word intentional about, if I'm going to perpetuate my career, I want to be noted for X, Y, and Z. I want to be the guy that does X, Y, and Z. How does someone really develop that?
And that's a great question. And I think that can happen intentionally, or it can happen just by the situations that one gets drawn into. But I do think it's important in your career that as you're talking with your managers or others, what it is that you want to do. I worked with, when I first worked at Hasbro, I met a young guy in Australia. His parents were Korean. And he said to me, the first time we ever met, he was in marketing, and he said, one day I would like to move to Korea and work in Korea. And I said, well, do you speak Korean? He said, no, I don't speak Korean. And I said, well, that might be a problem because the market is very specific. I said, but you know what? It could happen or never happen. And some point in the middle, maybe is where you'll land. Turns out 6 months later, marketing director of Korea leaves. We need somebody on a new project. I remembered this conversation. He ends up moving to Korea. And this started a journey for this guy of being somebody who was willing to step into the hard thing. So he built that career, and that was his brand. And so two things happened. One was he was open to experience. He was open to challenge. But he was also very clear on the kind of thing he wanted. And I think that allows people to not see talents as egos. When somebody says, this is what I want, you can coach that person and help that person and aid that person. This is where I'd like to go, and these are the kinds of things I'd like to do. That's how you create brand for yourself. Of course, the person needs to be successful in those missions. But I think over time, a clarity with your management, the clarity with people that you work for and with about where you see yourself helps to create a path. My experience in leadership in HR is very few people are able to do that clearly,
Right.
especially earlier in their career. And so what often happens is somebody says, oh, I want to be the president of the division in 10 years. So that may or may not happen. The reality of the way organizations change is that job may not even exist in 10 years, right?
Right.
So what you want to do is say, I want to be in a position in this organization that's going to make a significant difference in 10 years. And these are the kinds of things that I'd like to do. That's a career path that somebody can help you go on. And that's how you build brand by then successively going through those experiences.
Yeah. Well, I'll share, if I may. There's a technique I used. I was introduced to this a long time ago by a good friend and colleague, and I've used it ever since. Something called an accomplishments inventory for that younger leader that's not sure what that thing is that they might want to declare as a brand. One way to get there is to take some time and look back over what you have done and create a bulleted list of accomplishments, but not just, I was leader of a sales team. You got to be a little more specific. You got to say certain size, certain outcome, certain challenge, and you identify those things in a long list, and I call it an inventory. And then you go back over that list and you do some simple grading of pluses and minuses. We've all had the experiences. We say, I did that. I'm glad I did it. I was proud of it, but I don't ever want to have to do that again. Well, that's a minus. The pluses, on the other hand, are obviously very fulfilled, excited, motivated. If you could do that all day long, you would be a happy camper. If you then aggregate all of those pluses and start looking for a pattern of common denominators, was it something about leading the people? Maybe it was working with certain technologies. Maybe it was certain market conditions. Maybe it was problem solving, transition, transformation. It's wide open what the possibilities are. But if you identify those common denominators into a pattern, guess what? That's probably a good indicator of what you're wired to do well. It's motivating to you, it's satisfying, it's fulfilling, and why not spend the rest of your career doing things like that?
I love that.
And
it's a great way to find a mentor in an organization who knows you and is willing to play that out with you.
Right.
Maybe not even your boss, because your boss has motivations for you that may not be just about you.
Right.
Try to find a independent consultant in the business or that knows you quite well. I think it's an important
I love
outlet.
it. Well, let's get back. Let's talk about your book. Give us the title of the book.
So the book is called Bond: Belonging and the Keys to Inclusion and Connection. I never envisioned myself as an author. Actually, I thought I was going to be a travel writer at one point in my life because I love traveling. And then I did some travel writing and I realized, I love traveling more than writing about it. And so I had a couple of, I talked about mentors, but I had a couple of very important mentors in my life who encouraged me to write down some of the experiences and stories and lessons that came from them. And the book I wrote is a compilation of stories and lessons, what I call keys, that are very much related to, in my experience, the importance of inclusion and belonging in organizations. And, I started the book in an era where I started to see diversity and inclusion becoming bad words, and people losing the kind of the forest, missing the forest for the trees. And also that diversity and inclusion itself was becoming a very bifurcated discussion. There were people that were very for it and people very against it. And the reality is, if you're a business person and you look at the data, there's very strong data that shows that diverse organizations, however you measure that, I don't mean that diversity is in any way a narrow definition. Diversity is all the difference in the workplace that comes from experience, life, where you were brought up, where you went to school, all of these kinds of things. Those organizations in inclusive environments where the company or the organization nurtures people to feel a sense of belonging, led by leaders that know how to do that, far outperform their peer groups that don't have those elements. And so the book is about getting back to that, the business case of why, inclusive and diverse organizations do better. They just do better. It's really not up for argument. The data is there. Now, you can argue against some of the methods, you can argue against some of the legal constructs that have been developed. That's an argument to be had. What I sought to do in the book was, through my own experiences, successes and many failures, to bring people back into a discussion about inclusion that was more inclusive, that anyone could sort of enter into the discussion and not feel threatened by the language and the terminology and being called out for saying the wrong thing or naming somebody the wrong name. And that's really the journey I went on with the book. And I hope that it's a very timely discussion because, again, I really believe strongly that those elements in businesses are important. And I don't want to lose that element because I think you can see the superpower it brings to an organization.
Yeah. I'd be really excited to grab that story and go through it. I know in my own experience, I've watched the evolution of what used to be a little more, for lack of a better word, I'll call it pure motive to create inclusivity at work by wanting to be open to hiring others of different backgrounds, skills, abilities, experiences, and add that to the mix so that you have a much richer dynamic. But that was many, many years ago when that was the basic meaning of inclusion at work. And then it got, politicized and weaponized, and it became such a polarizing topic among many camps. Because of my own sort of military upbringing, I still have a lot of connections with folks who have worked in and around the Pentagon and still much a part of that, military backbone that we have in America. And, DEI just about cratered our military effort. It became such a flashpoint and such a highly debated topic that I think people miss the whole point of when we want to talk in its purest sense about diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's a much different discussion when you strip away all of those agenda items that some may bring.
Yeah. And if you look at the military is a great example. If you look at, again, the data, where you have diversity in project teams. I was at a conference a number of months ago, and there were all the people it was a conference about change management, and these were like heads of big organizations, head of Nike's change management, head of Tata, the India company change management, head of Nestle's change management, and they were talking about why is it so hard to create change in an organization, and they knew what I did. And the guy from Nestle said, "Well, it's not an issue of dynamic in the of techniques of change management. It's an issue of getting smart people around the table and everybody feeling like they have the ability to put their ideas on the table, to stop a bad idea when it's going the wrong direction, but really to have what you would call equity of voice in a meeting." And, the more diverse an organization is, the harder it is to do that. There's more technique to it. And the military is a perfect example where you want people around the table who say, that component part is going to bring a plane down if you use that. You don't want people that have too much groupthink. So however that person brings that unique experience voice to the table, other leaders, the leader of that working team, being able to say, "Hey, we haven't heard from you for a while. You seem to have, maybe you have a comment about this." If you don't bring that voice on the table, it could be a life or death situation. And diverse teams are measured to be 60% more able to spot risk than teams that are made up of the same people with the same experience, the same background. So you want that in a military setting. You want that in a production setting, because it can go from saving money to saving lives.
Yeah. Well, and to your point, it's not always the senior leader that's driving the train, and in fact, quite the contrary, it's the senior leader that has the wisdom and wherewithal to talk last and get everybody around the table speaking about it. And I often refer to there's an amazing documentary that Amazon Prime did on the Navy Blue Angels. And it's a very, very good thesis on team dynamics, leadership, and inclusion. And one of the key principles they've got is, as they take off and they fly in formation, well, the commander is in the lead plane, as maybe he should be. But when they do their practice runs and their debriefs and their reviews of things, it's actually one of the lesser pilots that's in the back of the formation that drives the meeting, because he saw it all. It's all up in front of him. He saw who was in and off and slow and fast, and he could call those shots. And he was given, basically, there was a point they mentioned, they essentially stripped the rank off the collar and put it in a desk drawer and have their discussion about performance. And, of course, their whole precision, that's what they're about, is precision and perfection. And, when you're flying at 400, 500 miles an hour and you get your wingtips 6 inches apart, you got to be pretty tight in your discipline and control of how you're doing things. And so it is a fascinating dynamic. And as I watched through it, I of course was dialed in on all the leadership ramifications of how they do it and what they do, and was just mesmerized by what they described.
We used to do this technique, which I just loved. Because in the team, it became a sort of practice. Some people would really even look forward to being designated. We would have, when we were doing strategic planning, a contrarian. And the contrarian's role was to challenge the groupthink. Because especially when you're doing creative thinking or you're doing strategic thinking, people can get really excited about great ideas. And then sometimes you need somebody to say, yes, but have we thought of this path, or have we accounted for this potential knock-on effect? And it's a really important thing. And oftentimes the people that come at it from those different ways of seeing things have had different experiences in the past, and they can bring a different approach to it. Sometimes it can be really frustrating when somebody keeps doing that for leaders. but you want to nurture that because that's how you get a better product at the end, and oftentimes how you don't miss things along the planning process.
Yeah. Well, I've got a direct story along that line, and I have told it before here on the show, but it's worth repeating, talking about the contrarian. I was commissioned to go in and do some team leadership work with a very senior leadership team at one of the big oil companies, and we had done some work for a while, and then we did kind of a team assessment, and it was this classic. Everybody was given a survey, and then we plotted things, and sort of the executive summary part of it was a classic four blocker, and you would argue you wanted everybody to be in that upper right quadrant because that was high performance, high value, all of that. And when we got the accumulated results back, there was a cluster of dots from all the team members up in that upper, but there was one guy way down in the opposite. And the day came to do the debrief on that survey, and I walked into the leader's office, and he said, "Hey," and he flipped to that page. And he said, "What should I do about this guy?" And I said, "Absolutely nothing." I said, my word that came to mind was, you can't go on a witch hunt. If you don't already know who that is, you can't do that. Let's see what the team has to say when we go in. And sure enough, we walked into the meeting, and everybody had already been given the book, so they were all kind of prepped. And before we barely got settled in our seats, one guy goes, "I'm him. I know I know I'm that guy."
With pride, probably.
And no, he was actually a little somber, and he said, "This proves something I've been thinking and feeling for a long time." He said, "I think I need to ask for a transfer. I hold this team back." And everybody kind of recoiled, and he went on a little bit about his frustrations. He said, "None of my ideas ever survive. I'm always arguing. I don't want to be that guy. I think I probably need to move on." And the team, before I or the leaders said anything else, the team started saying, "Absolutely not. You cannot leave. We want you here. We need you here. You're contrarian, and we're sorry if it makes you feel bad. Maybe we need to give our feedback a little differently, but we need your contrarian thought because we don't want to get sucked into groupthink, and we don't want to make bad decisions. And your voice always helps us crystallize a better decision. So please do not leave."
And that's a great story and a great example of it. And one of the things that's also, I think, missed in the diversity and inclusion and belonging discussion is that somebody like that, when they feel like then they belong really on that team, can move from "I should go somewhere else" to doing all of that incremental effort that maybe in the past he wasn't willing to do or didn't feel was valued. And that's again how organizations win. When teams are, everybody's got a job description, but when individuals are doing the incremental effort, they're working across lines of business, they're working with their peers, they're staying maybe a little bit later, they're thinking about work when they're in the shower. That incremental effort is the productivity that organizations can capture and win. And when you feel like you're on a team, just the experience you talked about, Doug, where people are like, "You belong here. This team you're as much up there as we are, even though you're in a different box." That person will excel and have more effort and be more committed to the work. And that's the beauty of belonging in an organization.
Well, for me, that engagement was actually pretty interesting on several levels. Part of the scope of what we were trying to do, we also were challenging the team to come up with, we were borrowing some pages out of Patrick Lencioni's work on, team development. We were trying to define a team charter and a team contract on operating. And when I got to talking about the contract piece, I said, we need to kind of more formally define our rules of engagement and how the team ought to operate and what we ought to do. And one of the gentlemen, and this was a global company, so he was a German by heritage, and not picking on them, but just we're talking about diversity. So anybody that's ever worked with Germanic folk, what I'm getting ready to say. He was a little bit autocratic, and he said, "We don't need to do this. We all know how we work and what we think." And there was a lady sitting next to him, and she kind of turned sideways and looked at him, and she said, "No, we don't. we don't know that at all, you know. And he kind of shut down, and not in a bad way, but he just deferred. And she said she went on a little bit of a moment, and she said, "No, I think this will be valuable to us. We need to understand how we want to do this, and we need to have this discussion. We need to carry this forward." And a couple of more hours into the effort, you know, it started crystallizing, and kind of in the middle of everything, he said, "Can I take a pause a minute?" And we called on him and said, "Sure, what?" And he said, "I want to make a public apology to my colleague." He said, I get it now, and I retract everything I said. No, we don't know how we want to operate, and this has been enlightening. It's been helpful for me. And bottom line, this whole team had an amazing level of emotional intelligence. We talk about that a lot now in leadership. They were all pretty profoundly aware, but up to the point we were doing this work, they had still all operated pretty autonomously and not really cohesively as a team. And the leader of it all, the executive I was directly working for, if you will, he said his summary conclusion was, he said, "Hey folks," he said, "I want you to think back early in your career. You know how we used to always say those guys, and we were pointing up the organization." He said, "Guess what? We are them." You know, so we are now them. So let's don't let our people be pointing up, going, "Oh, those guys." You know, if those guys would just figure it out and get it better, we could do better. But
yeah. It also highlights the difficulty of change in organizations that are multicultural or multi-experience. When I was with Hasbro, we were doing a big change management in the supply chain organization, and the change was not just about diversifying where things were made. It was about moving from the philosophy of producing to the philosophy of serving. And so that's a big change for people who have their whole life been working on component parts for toys. There's not always an understanding of, we're serving others in the organization. And we had a number of moments, when you're talking about the one you went through, a number of those moments, people saying, "We don't need to do this." And what we would end up doing is saying, "Well, let's talk to the customer, or let's talk to the consumer." We would bring that data or these voices in, and they thought, "Okay, maybe we do need to do this." So I think a lot of times, again, in the scope of bringing voices into a room for better decision making, it takes time. It's not easy. May not be as easy on face. They need experts like you to come in and help facilitate that kind of discussion. But at the end, I imagine this team you worked with, after their epiphany and getting their charter together and then their plans together, were much more solid in their direction and their output.
yeah, totally. Absolutely. Well, I can't let you get away without you drop the name GE. So let's talk about your experiences living through the infamous Jack Welch culture.
So I started my career at GE in a call center. And if ever there was a great place to start your professional career, it was a call center. And I spent, my days, people calling and shouting at me, complaining about this not working or that not working or this delivery not working. And at the time, it was such a difficult thing to go through. But as a foundation for me and the rest of my career, understanding how to communicate with people, especially when they are emotionally charged, became an incredibly valuable tool and a technique for me. But it was, at the time, GE was the company. I remember somebody saying to me, what they say about GE people is, if you look around the world, who's running the biggest companies in the world, it's not if they worked for GE, it's just when they had worked for GE. And you saw that in a lot of big companies around the world. And I was very fortunate. I had an incredible manager at GE who, in essence, was a second father to me. And he's the one who helped me to progress eventually into leaving GE and going to Disney. He was so insightful about who I was because he got to know me. And this is, I think, another lesson of mine in leadership, is really getting to know the people that work for you so that you can help them sort of see the things they may not see because they don't have the experience. At this point, I was just out of college, so I had very little working experience. And he at one point said, I was actually working in sales. I was working in GE Lighting. So I was calling on supermarkets and distributors, and I was selling light bulbs. And he at one point said to me, I think you should consider a career in HR. And I didn't even know what that meant. And he gave me some experiences by running some projects, some productivity projects that were going on in the company that Jack Welch was sponsoring. And ultimately, when I went to Disney, I had another manager who was a great friend and mentor, and he said the same thing to me. So I thought there must be something to this HR thing. And that was how I got involved with being in HR. So GE was a tremendous place to start a career. And I was very fortunate to have some great managers and peers at the time.
Yeah, fascinating. Well, Greg, I think we're about up on time for today. Thanks so much. Tell folks the best way to get a hold of you.
So you can reach me on LinkedIn. I am there very often, and also at gregmorley.com. And if people are interested to pick up the book, it's very available at all of your favorite electronic booksellers around the world. And my goal in writing the book was really to be able to influence the conversation in a way that we talk today, in a sort of very practical, accessible, non-emotional way. And I hope that that's the outcome of the effort through the book.
Great. Well, as always, folks, we'll have those links in the show notes. So please, when you're in a safe place and can pause, check out the links there and hop over and look at Greg's work. But with that, I think we're going to wrap this up today. I do want to remind you, if you need to get a hold of me and would like to talk more about your own leadership journey or what may be happening in your company, hop over to my website at dougthorpe.com. There's opportunity to get some downloads of some other resources, take a couple of different kinds of assessments if you like, and always happy to do a free discovery call with you just to talk about your situation, determine what might be next. So with that, we're going to sign off, say goodbye. Go out there, make it a great day.
You've been listening to Leadership Powered by Common Sense, hosted by Doug Thorpe. If you would like to know more about the coaching and advisory services he provides, visit dougthorpe.com.